So I'm wondering what you think of this idea of FITT. It seems like a slightly odd title, doesn't it? And I've got a couple of images here. They're going to help us. But I guess first of all, let's just make sure we understand that FITT refers to frequency. It refers to intensity. It refers to time. And it refers to type of training. Okay, now I'm not sort of sketched this out particularly well, but it goes without saying that what we're referring to here is that our F is here, our I is here, our T to make up FITT. Okay, so that's the first principle. That's what this thing actually is, this acronym. And we've got a couple of images that are going to help here, but I want to sort of take on notion of frequency, and I really want us to address what this means. Before we do that, let's just all realize that what we are talking about here is the principle of training of progressive overload. And if you haven't looked at that teaching on principles of training yet, I do encourage you to do that, because it will inform your understanding of this, because we've kind of touched on this being gradual and steady, about increasing the stress on the body. Well, this is how we increase that stress. So let's take frequency first of all, and let's see if we can work on this. What do we mean by frequency? Well, it's fairly obvious. It's how often one trains. Okay, so let's take our sprinter here. Here he is. If this athlete is training something like 4 times a week, his frequency is times 4. Okay, fairly easy. We've got Tuilangi here, who's a professional rugby player. He's probably training between 5 and 6 times a week. That's right. Now, frequency is interesting in terms of training. So there's 2 ways of looking at it. One is how often you're training. That's exactly what I've put here. But the other one could be a ratio of training. And it could be a ratio of training to competition. So think about, let's say, Tuilangi here. It could be that he's training 5 times a week and he's competing once a week. That's a ratio of 5 to 1. All right. Whereas our gymnast might be training 10 sessions to every one competition, or 15. These ratios are variable depending on the sport and the activity that we do. Now, what I would stress is that we want performers to be doing a minimum of 3 times a week. And there's a reason for that, because we don't want reversibility to set in. So that's a good piece of guidance. Why? Because we want to prevent the principle of reversibility. So we don't want that reversibility setting in. So therefore, 3 times a week at least is a good one. But also, we want to sort of recognize that how often someone's training is usually affected by status. So just to be clear here, let's imagine that our cricketer is a professional and our gymnast is an amateur. It's quite likely that our professional cricketer is going to be training more often, because they've got that status and their lifestyle allows that to be the case. So we need to be aware of that. And of course, what we're doing with progressive overload, we would up the frequency over time, right? Once we're at a full-time status, obviously it's hard to up after that. Now, intensity of training is continually adjustable. And a couple of ways that we can adjust intensity, we can look in at percentage of max heart rate. This is going to be really important for things like continuous training, interval training, fartlek training, for example. If we're looking at something like resistance training, we could be looking at the percentage of our 1 rep max that we're lifting or that we're shifting. We could be using things like Borg scales. Now, a Borg scale is what we call an RPE. I'll write this in for you, an RPE. We will touch on this in aspects of this course. It's a rate of perceived exertion. Okay, now we're going to look at this quite a lot when we look at overtraining. So a Borg scale is someone effectively, like, they're on a run, say, they're doing some continuous work, and they in their own mind, or they could report to their coach, look, I'm working at a 7 out of 10. Now, a Borg scale is actually out of 20, so they might say I'm working at a 14 out of 20. We can look at intensity that way, but of course, it's subjective. Now, we've got another model. I'm not going to teach it here because it's its own lesson, really, but feel free to go and have a look at it. We've got the Carvonen Principle. Now, the Carvonen Principle is a model of working with heart rate. And it takes into account the desired target heart rate range, but also the individual's resting heart rate. And I'll allow you to look into that if you're interested. I'm not going to teach the whole thing. I've got whole tutorials on that on other courses, but for here, we'll leave it there. Now, what I would say to you here is that when we're trying to increase training, it's usually not intensity that's first, okay? Usually not intensity is first. So when we're looking to overload, it's often the frequency or the time of training that's increased initially. Just be aware of that. Now let's look at time itself, okay? Now, it's fairly obvious. We could just sort of say it's how long we train for, right? So if we're on a jog, how long we run for, okay, fine. How long trainings last, that's a part of this. But also realize that for something like continuous training, it's got to be over 20 minutes. Okay, so over 20 minutes is got to be for continuous training. If we were looking at high impact training, HIIT training, or high impact interval training, it could be a lot less than this, but for something like continuous, it's a minimum of this, and we'll look into why. So if I put at least that for aerobic work, now I realize someone might say HIIT training is an exception, but also another factor of time is how many repetitions we're doing. So let's take our gymnast. Let's say she's doing some gymnasium work. I mean, like some resistance training, and let's say she's bench pressing, and she's bench pressing at something like 80% of 1 rep max, and she's bench pressing, let's say 8 reps at a time. Okay, that is a measure of time. So is how many sets the performer does. So if our performer does 4 sets of 8 reps, both of those are measures of time. So is the exact length of our recovery time. So let's say our sprinters here, let's say they are doing 12 reps of 70 meters in their training. Okay, let's say they're doing that. That would be that would relate to our time, but so would the time between each repetition. So if they had, for example, 60 seconds recovery, for argument's sake, that would be the recovery time. And that's a really, really interesting point. And the point I would make about recovery time is we must measure it, and it must be specific. It's often something that's forgotten by athletes to really, really address. And finally, guys, with type, we're looking at including different types of training. So we could refer to this as variance. We've looked at this concept in Principles of Training. We could call it the combined approach. You know, again, we're looking to have different experiences within training sessions. We call that a combined approach. We want to have a range of components of fitness. So again, think of our sprinters here. Yes, they're going to do some speed work, working on intervals, but maybe they'll do some flexibility training as well. It's really good, therefore, to maintain motivation. Again, if you've watched my teaching on the Principles of Training, I talked about this in quite a lot of detail. And it's also really good to prevent overuse injuries, which of course in turn prevents reversibility setting in. So that's our FITT principle. Just to remind you, it's how we progressively overload. Thanks.